I'd like to welcome you here tonight to this session we've titled Looking the Wrong Way, the SIS in New Zealand. And just before I speak, I should say the housekeeping arrangements, the most important one, I think, if there's a fire, we move out and locate to the north. The building, I'm assured by the church, is fully earthquake strengthened, so if there's an earthquake, the instructions are to drop, cover and hold, and trust in the Lord. The reason for tonight's session is, there are several reasons. The first is that there has been a series running on Radio New Zealand called The Service, which purports to be about the SIS and was based on the experiences of John Daniel's mother, who was recruited by Brigadier Gilbert in the 1960s probably. Brigadier Gilbert was known for recruiting young women of a certain class into the service, and in my opinion the series starts a bit like Boy's Own Paper, but carries on to much more serious issues. The second issue is the fact that shortly there will be a commission of inquiry into the lead up to the Christchurch massacre, in which it appears that the service and the GCSB were caught by surprise, and also that it appears that we are not to know much about how that inquiry has developed, what will be revealed in the course of it, only what we will be told at the end. So we asked Richard and Nicky, who both have personal experience with the activities of the SIS. Richard back in the days when he was president of CARE, the Council Against Racial Thank you, Richard. Citizens Association for Racial Equality, my mistake. And also involved in the CND. Richard? Yeah, okay, so everybody knows the CND. And talking to Richard briefly, one of the concerns that I certainly have is today, when the doomsday clock is closer to midnight than it has ever been, the awareness of the issues around peace and nuclear disarmament appear to me not to be in the forefront of our consciousness as much as it appears to be they should be. And Nicky I've known since the days when he worked with Owen Wilkes on peace issues at what Nicky tells me was Sydney Street East and is now Kate Shepherd Place, close to Parliament. I remember those days as well. And so Nicky has been a peace activist and a critic and one of our cherished, in my mind, public intellectuals in the area of peace issues and openness to the issues that confront us as a government. So I hope that Richard and Nicky will both speak, and then we'll have some questions, and then we'll wrap it up, and we should be finished from here by about 7 o'clock. Fortunately, both Richard and Nicky will have a microphone, so they won't need to use the pulpit voice. So welcome, Richard. Thank you very much for coming. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
So responsibility for national security in New Zealand was originally the role of a special section of the New Zealand Police. But during the Second World War, a con man fooled them. He was kept in comfort throughout the Second World War by feeding them stories of an imminent German invasion. And the SIS was set up by then Prime Minister Sid Holland, one of the most evil prime ministers we've ever had, in 1956 to gather intelligence for national security. It was principally to check on activities promoted by or advancing the interests of the Soviet Union and other communist states. Another role was, and still is, to vet applicants for senior public service positions to avoid security risks. As part of our then deference to Great Britain, the heads of this new organisation, such as long-term Director Brigadier Gilbert and other senior positions, were recruited from military, police and intelligence positions in Britain and its colonies. Those drawn from the colonial service in the likes of Kenya and Rhodesia often brought with them unfortunate attitudes on racial issues. Those of us who are particularly active in the New Zealand campaign for nuclear disarmament, as I was as its president for 13 years, and other organisations campaign against nuclear weapons and New Zealand's association with them through testing and deployment, often anticipated that we would come to the attention of the SIS. When I asked for and received my SIS file in 2014, this proved to be the case. Other leading officials, C&D National Secretaries Mary Woodward and Myri Leadbeater, and also Kate Hughes, have also found that they had active SIS files. This was partly because nuclear disarmament was a cause being also promoted by the Soviet Union. The SIS did not believe that everyone who espoused that cause was a Soviet agent, but they believed a lot more of us were than was ever the case. I remember being strongly urged by a fellow peace movement activist to join the Peace Council, a body then closely aligned to the foreign policies of the Soviet Union. I declined to join for that reason, but my SIS file reveals that the approach was made by an SIS agent in order to test where my loyalties lay. It was also because the powers that New Zealand was and still is aligned to, principally the US and the UK, believed that peace in the Western way of life was best secured by nuclear deterrence, by mutually assured destruction, or MAD, and that ultimately it was better to be dead than red. It was better that human civilization be destroyed than that it be run by communists. This belief that it was better to destroy millennia of cultural, artistic, scientific, engineering and architectural accomplishment rather than temporarily suffer from an oppressive government was the official line of the government and of the SIS. The alternative idea of rejecting being part of nuclear deterrence and likely nuclear war, and instead seeking phased nuclear disarmament, was seen as subversive and highly threatening to our national security. The Korean War, and especially the Vietnam War, had the majority of New Zealanders believing in the so-called domino theory. If one Asian country became communist, it would then knock over its neighbour into becoming communist, and so on until somehow this took over New Zealand. At the time, I heard people saying that they very much feared this red menace and were also terrified about the yellow peril. So I publicly described that combined fear as being of an orange penis stabbing down from Southeast Asia. A second reason for my being on an SIS file was because as a political studies student I had taken part in a demonstration against the presence of an SIS agent, David Godfrey, on the Auckland University campus. David had told the head of the political studies department, Bob Chapman, of his status as an SIS agent and of the benefit that he and his department hoped to gain from his taking part in Stage 3 political studies course, but he undertook not to be investigating on campus. It was inappropriate to record political ideas that teenage students were testing out in tutorials and the coffee bar to go into a government agency, potentially a file to affect their future careers. Godfrey's status was not known to students, but they became suspicious when he asked inappropriate questions of Students' Association staff and at Student Society meetings. After he was outed on the front page of student newspaper Outspoke, a demonstration was organised outside the Political Studies Department room where his class was taking place. On David's advice to the lecturer, the police were called. 2 wharf police arrived, ordered us to leave the building and removed those who didn't. I achieved notoriety by immediately going limp, being carried downstairs and tossed off the front veranda. There was a fierce debate in Parliament led by Minister Tom Shand and an official inquiry before a judge who failed to comprehend the key issues. My SIS file said I was arrested at the demonstration, which was not true and could have affected my ability to travel to allied countries, particularly the US. When I asked for and received my SIS file in 2014, this was one of significant errors of fact in it. Another was the allegation that I'd travelled to the US in 1977 at the behest of the Socialist Unity Party. I didn't. I went in 1978 to the UN as the official representative of NGOs to the UN Special Session on Disarmament. The only extracurricular activity I undertook was a meeting with the UN Human Rights Office to lodge a complaint by Ngāti Whātua, then occupying Takapara Bastion Point. The third main reason I was under surveillance and on their file was because I was chair of the Citizens Association for Racial Equality. In this role, I campaigned actively for a Race Relations Act for New Zealand and for an end to discrimination in our immigration policy on the basis of race or national origin. At that time, the Northern European countries were defined as, quote, traditional immigration source countries, and their citizens could migrate here fairly easily, but most nationalities could not. Iceland was regarded as a traditional source country, but Italy, India and China, from whom many more migrants had come over time, were not. But what the SIS was particularly concerned about was that we campaigned for non-violent direct action against economic and sporting ties with apartheid South Africa. My file clearly implies that the apartheid leaders Vorster and Verwoerd were seen as defenders of Western civilization in Africa, while Nelson Mandela was a pro-communist terrorist. Our planning of citizens and other direct action on rugby fields was a legitimate concern for the police, but it should not have been seen as a matter of national security. But clearly the SIS already had a blind spot towards the international and internal threat posed by white supremacists. The SIS ought not to be a tool for partisan politics. For most SIS ministers it has not been, but Rob Muldoon rammed the 1981 Springbok tour through, clearly with the aid of intelligence gathered by the SIS. He also called a press conference to release the list of all the people the SIS believed were members of the Socialist Unity Party. This was in order to claim that the trade union movement and the Labour Party were riddled with Soviet agents and that patriotic New Zealanders needed to vote for the National Party. Until this time, also, the SIS was particularly independent and frequently leaked material to the newspaper Truth, New Zealand Truth, in order to discredit New Zealanders who it considered as being involved in subversive activities. Being on an active SIS file did not seem to hinder my becoming the Labour MP for Eden in 1984. I was appointed to chair Labour's Justice Caucus Committee, which had responsibility for developing and implementing policy on justice, the courts, corrections, electoral law and immigration. As chair of the Labour government's 1986 Immigration Policy Review, I was able to take the lead in finally ending discrimination on grounds of national origin and race in our immigration policy. As chair of the Electoral Law Committee, we changed our voting from crossing out all but the favoured candidate instead of simply giving her a tick, brought in a short one-month qualifying period for electoral enrolment until the day before an election, and helped set up a Royal Commission on the electoral system, which led eventually to the introduction, we recommended and eventually led to the introduction of the mixed member proportional electoral system. I was also appointed deputy to Bill Dillon as chair of the Justice Select Committee of Parliament. Because Bill was appointed regional liaison person for the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and travelled frequently, I often chaired the committee. We reviewed estimates of expenditure for a range of government departments. The budget entry for the SIS was a simple one-line item setting out their total spend. We summoned them before us and asked various questions about their role, priorities and categories of spending. They insisted the hearing be confidential, the Fourth Estate were ushered out, and then, except for the most generic questions about their role, they simply refused to answer anything on spending or anything else on the grounds of national security. When I received my SIS file, it revealed that my file had been active all the time I was an MP and was not finally closed until I left Parliament at the end of 1996. When David Longy told Caucus that the issues the SIS were putting most resources into in late 1984 were surveillance of agents of the Soviet Union and of Maori radicals, he persuaded them to drop the substantial resources they are putting into spying on Maori rights activists. Unfortunately, future SIS ministers were not as determined. The surveillance of them resumed, and the police raid on Tūhoe was one of the sort of consequences of that. But apart from that brief disclosure, caucus members knew little of the activities of the SIS. I was keen that the Longy and Palmer initiatives, generally for more open government, should also apply to the SIS as far as practicable, consistent with genuine national security concerns. Apart from their total spend and the identity of their director, the only other information they were required to reveal to Parliament was the bare number of interception warrants they had issued to check mail and tap phones, etc., in that year. I put forward policy proposals that they should also disclose the number of interception warrants still continuing year on year, and the judge should be required also to sign off each warrant to prevent them being used for political purposes the way Muldoon had. Guy Esper, as part of his series, acquired the SIS's own secret responses to my policy paper with scrawls on them they had added saying nonsense and no and never beside each line in my proposal they didn't like. Later I proposed the establishment of a senior parliamentary committee including the leader of the opposition with genuine powers to query and review the spending and operations of the SIS, and also for the establishment of an independent commissioner able to review controversial interception warrants and to initiate investigations into particular SIS activities. The SIS scotched those proposals then, but since I left Parliament, they have both come to pass. When I was in Parliament, I might have been considered ripe for the provision of intelligence for governments, diplomats and agents. However, it was the American and British diplomats I found most active. With Geoffrey Palmer's agreement, I spent many pleasant hours over coffee talking with the British diplomat about our proposed justice reforms, particularly the proposed Bill of Rights, because the British government was considering a similar measure. Finally, it was while I was out of Parliament from 1990 to 1993 that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union finally invited me to Russia. Ruth Dyson, the then party president, and I were invited to come to advise them on how to become a successful social democratic party given that democracy was being brought in at that time. And so we met their theoreticians, and I remember a discussion saying, what is your policy and attitude to land and the ownership of land? I said, up till 1928, we believed there should be no private ownership of land, but we didn't get elected, so we changed that. He said, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union will never give up the land of Mother Russia. So they haven't been very successful since then. We also met the newly elected City Council of St. Petersburg, where the then deputy mayor, whose name was Vladimir Putin, said, what's your political philosophy? I outlined pretty uncontroversial social democratic policy, and he said, you are too left-wing to get elected in St. Petersburg. And so I'm in the position that I was too right-wing to be a Soviet agent, a Russian agent before the change of government there, and then I became too left-wing to be able to do it. So I'm sorry, I'm innocent. As well as their obsession with Maori radicals rather than with white supremacists, there were other examples of the SIS looking the wrong way. Obviously, their deep concern about Muslim extremism while ignoring white supremacists was exposed by the Christchurch shootings. They've also been revealed as illegally breaking into Wellington High Commissions and embassies of countries with which we do not have any substantial disagreements, including India. During the USS Buchanan affair and the voyage of the Rainbow Warrior into the French testing zone, the SIS was still keeping tabs on the campaign for nuclear disarmament and on Greenpeace. They took no interest in the activities of the agents of Western countries, including of France. After the Rainbow Warrior bombing, it was the New Zealand public and the New Zealand police who impressively found the culprits, with no help from the SIS. Then, after the Buchanan was denied entry into New Zealand and the United States retaliated by cutting off most of their intelligence from us, the SIS and the GCSB strongly lobbied the Labour government to establish the Waihopai Signals Intelligence Installation. Longy briefed our caucus committee at our request. He told us it would be run entirely by the New Zealand GCSB. It collect absolutely all telephone, radio and other electronic communications made throughout the South Pacific and Antarctica. It would analyse all the data from this region, including communications by the governments of Fiji, Samoa and Tonga, by the French in their Pacific territories, and all private communications which happen to use certain keywords and phrases. We found that there were some practical limitations to our spying in the South Pacific. The first Fiji coup was a surprise because it was organised by one man talking face to face with his mates. The Tongan riots and fires where they set on Chinese businesses were also organised verbally rather than through sophisticated devices. The GSP was not to analyse any of these communications by ordinary New Zealanders. However, it did then, and still does, send the whole analysed bundle of signals data from this region of the world that we were responsible for as part of Five Eyes intelligence gathering agreement on to its sister agency in the United States. The US agency certainly would seek to analyse New Zealand citizens' communication of interest that they received from the GCSB, particularly because we're not allowed to be given US intelligence, seemed to be then, and still does, that we should only send on relevant material that we'd analysed and not all the raw data for them to be able to spy on New Zealanders. We've remained throughout a loyal member of the Five Eyes network with the US, UK, Canada, Britain and Australia. An SIS manager appeared before the Justice Select Committee when asked him where his loyalties lay, and he said it was to the West. This was clearly to the white, English-speaking, Anglo-Saxon capitalist democracies. However, I believe, given our progressive history, our ethnic diversity, our location in the world and our values, that we should not automatically align with the West. Often we should align with the interests and values of those in the Pacific Islands, Asia and the Nordic countries. Sticking unthinkingly always with the West is simply looking the wrong way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was fantastic. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce Nicky Hager, who will be known to many of you. Nicky will take on from, historically from where Richard left off, probably in the end much the same. So welcome, Nicky. Thank you.
Kia ora tātou. Can you hear me? It's good to be here with lots of familiar and friendly faces and people I've known for a long time. In Wellington. I'm going to take over from Richard. Sort of chronological, he went to the mid-90s, and I'm going to take on the story from there with, and you might have thought, it might sort of seem set up that he was talking about the bad old days of the SIS, and I'm really going to be talking about the bad new days of the SIS in comparison. And I'm also going to finish off, like he did, by talking about quite what's going on and what the issues still are for why we're part of the Five Eyes Alliance after all these years. So I'll start in the mid-90s, and you may remember this time, which were dark days for the intelligence agencies of New Zealand. There were dark days because the Cold War had finished, and there were all kinds of people raising their voices saying, do we even need intelligence agencies like this anymore? Do they need so much money? Why are they using so much resources? And there was a great sense of insecurity in the New Zealand, in fact many intelligence agencies around the world at that time. But all that changed, of course, on September 11, 2001, which is where I pick up the story. And I was lucky enough to be leaked a pile of the early documents that were prepared for the Labour government after the September 11 attacks. And the thing that's really stood out for them, apart from the obvious things like giving them more money and things, was not a sense of gloom, but a sense of excitement and opportunity. I'm not kidding. There was this, finally, life begins again. In the first 10 years, the SIS staff were doubled, their budget tripled, and it became very familiar for people to use the following words. They would say, terrorism is the greatest threat to New Zealand. And I found this maddening from the very beginning, because terrorism was never even a very small threat to New Zealand. It was completely unrealistic. It was a sign of loyalty to the Allies and what they were saying. It was kind of like a badge of membership of the Western Intelligence Club. And so otherwise perfectly intelligent people would have to repeat this obvious untruth when in fact for New Zealand we had a vastly greater threat from biodiversity threats, from spiders and shipping containers than we ever had from terrorism. By 2004, the SIS's annual report said that international terrorism, quote, continued to be the service's main preoccupation. If I had run the SIS, I'm sure I would have put terrorism on my list at that time, but it would have been quite well down the list, and I would have wanted to keep a clear eye on what New Zealand's interests were. Because terrorism, as I said, was never the greatest threat to New Zealand. It showed a captured kind of thinking. By doubling the number of staff and by tripling the income of the SIS, and by saying that its main preoccupation and purpose was to study international terrorism, it was, of course, like other countries were at that time, inevitable that they would find what they were looking for. And this is not an original story. You will all remember in 2002 when exactly what they were looking for arrived in Auckland Airport and asked for refugee status, and was picked up by, taken by a cavalcade of police cars and other vehicles with a helicopter flying overhead. Such was the threat that was involved, and was soon in the newspapers as a terrorist suspect coming into New Zealand. You'll remember the name Ahmed Zawi. I'm going to give a quick overview of these years, but Ahmed Zawi, as New Zealand's main war of terror suspect, should be remembered very carefully, because within a relatively short time, that's maybe the first year, it became abundantly evident to anybody who was in any way reading documents and understanding the words that he wasn't a terrorist of any sort at all. But the SIS continued fighting him doggedly through court case after court case and refusing to back down for 5 or 6 years. And what was their triumph? The triumph was that their main war on terror suspect was one of Algeria's leading Democrats and human rights defenders. Like, it couldn't have been much further off the mark. At the same time, there were all kinds of subtle changes going on. When WikiLeaks released in 2010 that huge trove of US Embassy cables, there were cables in there about the developments that the SIS was doing with assistance from the US agencies. And one of them was a new US Homeland Security system of databases and alerts, which essentially integrated New Zealand into a system of who the goodies and who the baddies were in the world. These huge databases of who were the suspects. And this was all very fine. You might remember this time when, that period where all sorts of wrong people or wrong raced people were being thrown off planes and taken out of queues in the United States. But we got put into the same system at that time to do with who was stopped in the airports here. And of course to make it more difficult for future Ahmed Zawis to ever even reach our shores. Also at that time, we're talking about the about 2006, 2005, 6, that period. Other WikiLeaks documents that were released showed that New Zealand, the New Zealand government was spying on which of the embassies in Wellington? The Iranian embassy. This is the thing that the Radio New Zealand series has just found out, and all those years later, they were still carefully watching the 3 diplomat Iranian embassy here in Wellington. And they were also, you may remember this, for a few years of annual reports of the SIS through those first years of the 2000s. They talked about how they had a project working on eliminating New Zealand's support for the development of weapons of mass destruction. Does that ring a bell with anyone? And the story behind that, which I found out from internal documents and from people working at the SIS, was that there was a program particularly of watching Iranian students. In other words, what we were saying was that we were in a new era of Islamic terrorism, but it was the same old business, the same old alliance business of helping to spy on anything and everything to do with Iran, because it was of its enemy status of our allies. And there was a classic story at that time where a man had got a scholarship to come from Iran to work with a prestigious scientist at Canterbury University, and kept being rebuffed by unseen officials, and finally was told that the reason why he was being refused, this is after he'd put his life on hold for a year or more, was because his research was involved nuclear issues, weapons of mass destruction. To which he wrote back, "My research is about stem cells, that kind of nuclei, not the other kind of nuclei." But this was really a serious issue. The SIS was asking at that time for academics in different universities to help point out the students, the suspect students. It was a little period of madness, is what I'm saying. And as a summary of that, another of the US Embassy cables that came out at that time said that they noted that the Prime Minister, Helen Clark, quote, has been willing to address targets of marginal benefit to New Zealand that could do her political harm if made public. And that's really the story of many of the operations that Richard talked about, and I am as well. There's a pattern to this. The next date that I would like to point out on this, which is one that you don't automatically remember, is the 22nd of July 2011. Not the 21st of September, some other time, the 22nd of July 2011. This was the date when a far-right ideologue went to a Norwegian Labour Party student summer camp and tried to kill as many of the people as he could. John Key was in Washington at the time and spoke up against the horror of Islamic terrorism before he heard what it was. And the reason I'm raising this is that if that had been an attack on the Twin Towers, the SIS would have remodelled all of its sections and asked for more resources, etc., etc., etc. But it's not even mentioned in the next annual report. This was the thing which I have feared most in the last 10 years personally, which is the rise of the far right in Europe and how that can destabilise that part of the world and therefore our part of the world and the threats that come from that. But as you know, and as has been discussed widely since the Christchurch attacks, it didn't seem to go on the radar of the SIS. And there's a simple reason for that, which was that it wasn't on the radar of their allies, which is the knee-jerk, routine way that they set their priorities. Another target from 2011, who I'll just mention, was myself for the SIS, and shows again the kind of this ongoing, old-fashioned, kind of out-of-touch approach to the country, in my opinion. I would think that they were targeting me. And this was about when I published a book called Other People's Wars, which if you haven't read, I strongly recommend to you, about the war in Afghanistan. I reread the chapter of it on the SIS today to inform me on what I'm doing. And after I'd written that book, the Defence Force wanted to know who my sources were for it. And so they went to the SIS, who in turn went to the GCSB, who in turn, that's right, I'm thinking of a separate story coming. They went to the SIS, and the SIS monitored my telephone to try and find out who my sources were. And in their marvellously reliable way, they didn't even do it lawfully. They didn't bother to get a warrant. And when it was later I found out that this had happened, and it was investigated by the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, not only had they not got a warrant, but when they were challenged about the legal basis for it, they said that their reason was espionage, which is cranking out of touch again. Right, the following year, to move on from myself, the following year, in July and August of 2012, in case we think that the bad old days are gone, the SIS launched another of its biggest anti-terrorism operations of the War on Terror years. And I know about this, I only found out about this because I was going through the Snowden documents relating to New Zealand, and there was one rare section of the Snowden documents which had page after page of people's emails and Facebook messages, all of one man. And I was thinking, what's this about? And I eventually found out what it was. It was that the SIS, this is what I was trying to say a moment ago, the SIS had asked the GCSB to ask the American National Security Agency to spy on this New Zealander called Tony Fullman. And what they had in mind was that he was masterminding acts of terrorism in Fiji to overthrow the government of Fiji. The SIS, after monitoring him via the National Security Agency, got police and the SIS agents, raided his home, his former home, a place where he used to flat here in Wellington, other people who he'd met when he was in New Zealand. And it was kind of like the Ahmed Zari story, because they had not only sort of, sometimes that the terrorism suspect is kind of has rights, but they're kind of a dodgy, dark person, and we've still got to stick up for their rights. But like Ahmed Zawi, what they'd done is they had chosen this very fine man who I've since got to know, who was a democracy campaigner for Fiji, who wouldn't hurt a fly. But they raided his house, they took his passport, they bugged him, they got the United States intelligence agencies onto him, and then when they realised that they'd really mucked up, they never apologised to him. He just got his passport sent back to him and they went quiet for the rest of time. And then the final thing in my little chronology is, which was also in the Snowden documents, was that and this is in 2013, is that the New Zealand intelligence agencies were working together to try to spy on the Chinese consulate in Auckland for the National Security Agency, which I regard as a dangerous and ill-considered operation for New Zealand to be doing for a major trading partner on behalf of an old ally and of almost certainly no practical intelligence for gain to our own country. And naturally enough, as you all know, the intelligence services have almost forgotten about terrorism and they are highly preoccupied by China because China is the subject of the day for their principal ally. I believe that there's a common thread to all of this and to what Richard said, which is that our SIS is still behaving like an outpost of the US and UK intelligence agencies in the South Pacific. This is the Five Eyes, Five Nation, Anglo-Saxon, English-speaking, old colonial era alliance. So when we try to understand the SIS, what we find is that it's foreign agencies' priorities, which are predominantly the priorities of the SIS. And when we look at the operations of the SIS or the GCSB, like when we know the actual detail of the secret things that you don't normally hear, they're usually alliance operations as well. So I want to talk about some of that, just got a bit more time? I want to talk about some of the ideas lying behind this chronology and this long and sorry and probably going to continue story. First of all, I want to say that what you find is, where am I in my notes? Just as our security and intelligence agencies said that the greatest threat to New Zealand is terrorism year after year, when it abundantly wasn't the case, so too do they espouse that the Five Eyes Alliance is the natural home for New Zealand intelligence agencies, and, as I'm sure you've heard, that we're incredibly lucky to be there. There are three arguments that they usually use to justify why a small South Pacific country is basing its security intelligence on a British, American, Northern Hemisphere kind of alliance. And I'd like to run through these ones because we hear them so often that we mightn't critically examine them. The first of these is, which I'm certain you've heard, is that by belonging to the Five Eyes Alliance, we get huge amounts of intelligence, far more than we give. For example, there was in 2016, there was a big independent review of intelligence by Michael Cullen and Patsy Reddy, and they said, quote, "The Five Eyes is by far New Zealand's most valuable intelligence arrangement, giving us knowledge and capability far beyond what we could afford on our own." This argument is used as if it's self-evident, but it's not at all self-evident. The importance of intelligence is not measured by volume, but by relevance and how much it helps a country to advance its own interests. Most foreign intelligence is about foreign preoccupations and foreign interests, and it's laden with the foreign agencies' different outlooks. More important, the question of whether the Five Eyes Alliance suits New Zealand is mostly a question about what we give. If our agencies waste their time and undermine New Zealand's moral beliefs by spying on numerous countries who are not our enemies, by harassing the Ahmedzawis for years, by raiding democracy campaigners for Fiji and all the rest, then it's us who are giving far more than we get. It's even worse if the agencies concerned are ignoring New Zealand's real needs, as with defending New Zealand against right-wing extremism, just because they are, as a result of being focused on the operations that help their allies. Argument number 2. The next frequently heard argument is that the US and UK are natural partners of New Zealand. Again, this is treated as being self-evident. We are like-minded. We have common interests. We have common outlooks. It's said so often that we stop hearing it, despite the fact that it's obviously untrue. The US and the UK are hugely militarised countries. I recommend to you, if you haven't done this, get a map of the United States, which has got all the military bases on it. Look at the statistics of their spending. It is quite astonishing. It's more like science fiction than the world that we think we live in. They're nuclear weapon powers. They meddle in and destabilise countries around the world. They start wars that have caused immense suffering and displaced millions of refugees, with those refugees causing, apart from their own suffering, huge problems and destabilisation in Europe and North America and the Middle East. They undermine and spy on the United Nations. They oppose illegal sanctions and blockades on independent countries. And the list goes on. We suddenly remember this. We wake up from our slumbers to the idea that we're like-minded and we have the same interests and that we're the same kind of countries. But we're still repeatedly told that they're natural partners of New Zealand. And listening to Richard, I just want to digress. This reminds me kind of a parallel story in New Zealand and other countries, which is about the history of the Communist Party. Bear with me. Might not seem obvious. But there was, through our history in New Zealand, if you look at the history of the fine people who chose to belong to the Communist Party and believe in the Soviet Union and think that the Soviet Union would be, was the role model for a great and better future. They had reasonable grounds for that belief at the beginning. And then gradually, if I'm thinking back to the history I've seen of the Wellington Communist Party, gradually there was a disillusionment came on. It might have been Stalin and the ugliness of those years, and some of the people dropped out, or the invasion of Hungary, and some people dropped out. And so it marched on down through the years until eventually it was hard to find anybody, and even in the socialist group, who wanted to say that they thought the Soviet Union was a good idea. And that's a natural learning process. Now let's look at the equivalent for people who are defenders of the Anglo-Saxon alliance. When these alliances were formed in the late 40s and early 50s, but soon after the Second World War, it seemed kind of logical to lots of, maybe not highly politicised and critical thinkers, but, they helped us win the war. They saved us from the Japanese. It all kind of made sense. And then the contrary evidence started to pile on, is what my point of my little analogy is. It was the Korean War and the Vietnam War. It was the hideous operations of the CIA, destabilising democratic or left-wing countries around the world. It was about the Cold War itself, which wasn't a war of equals, and all the damage that caused, and all the proxy wars, and all the other things I mentioned, and the nuclear arms race. And during those years, the New Zealand public was doing what those communists had done during the Stalin years and things. They were peeling off. They were disappearing. They weren't thinking this was a great idea. And so how come our kind of pure party liners of the intelligence agencies are still telling us that our natural, perfect allies are the Anglo-Saxon countries? I mean, I ask you, I find it really fascinating. Haven't they been watching the same things all these years? There's one final argument, the third argument, which is heard less often, and that is that the New Zealand government couldn't safely leave the Five Eyes alliance if it wanted to. You may have heard this one as well. And this argument of the three of them, alas, probably has some truth to it. But what a crazy argument it is. It's like giving advice to someone who's married to an abuser or a mafia boss, saying, I'm not sure you can really afford to leave here. What kind of a basis for a relationship is this? And as Richard said, in fact, we just have to blink our eyes a few times and look at the world, and there are countries who are far more natural allies of New Zealand, who have far more common interests and common outlooks and similar size and similar aspirations to New Zealand. And they're the ones that believe in human rights and act like they believe in human rights and the rest of it, who are the natural allies of New Zealand. But us, our accidental stowaways on the Five Eyes ship back in the 1940s, because we happened to be one of the Commonwealth former colonial countries of the British Empire, who Britain took with it into the Anglo-American alliance back then, 70 years ago. Our stowaways were still there. It's astonishing. I think I'm endlessly amazed by it, and I think we shouldn't accept it as natural. So what I'm saying is, I think what Richard and I are talking about, to conclude, what we're talking about today is that the intelligence agencies in their alliance, unanalysed, may have made sense for New Zealand in the 1950s, 70 years ago, but they don't really fit modern New Zealand. Modern, Polynesian, relaxed, anti-militaristic, staunchly independent for many people New Zealand. They're colonial relics. They've changed more slowly than the rest of the country because they're secret and embedded in the old alliances. So while the rest of the country has been changing, they haven't changed as fast. And so what I'm saying is that, in effect, New Zealand is part way through a process of decolonisation. We're on the way, but we're not there yet. Nearly done.
Thank you very much, Nicky. Okay, right, floor's open for questions, I guess.
Kia ora both. I suppose I'm wanting to know what your vision for the future is regarding the SIS. Given it's what we've got, and there seems to be, in the last year or two, some movement, I don't know if the word reform has been used, but there's some mood to bring it into the 21st century. It is here, it's what we've got. Do we need an SIS? Can we realistically expect to reinvent it so that it's appropriate to what many of us need? Yeah, just where from here?
Thank you.
Well, one of the things is to think about which of the activities the SIS conducts that couldn't be done by the police. As I was mentioning, daubing colonial era statues, sit-ins by students about issues that they're concerned about. These are matters that are not matters of national security. They're matters of protection of property and good order, which are the role of the police. And yet the SIS has been stomping into this ground area with attitudes, as Nicky said, so much part of our colonial past, attitudes about really the predominance and rightness of white Western culture. And there's a lot of strength in white Western culture, but we're much more diverse than that, and there are other strengths that we need to bring to bear. So we really need an examination of what roles are particularly needed. And when probably some people remember when Angela Merkel discovered that the American security agencies were spying on all her communications with her staff. I can assure you that we are doing that for the South Pacific governments, and I think that is gross and abusive to be doing that to people whom we should have a very common interest and not be suspicious of. So I think in part the review of the Christchurch massacre should be hopefully an opportunity to see what role legitimately there is for the security agencies that is beyond what the police need to do.
I think you've asked the most important question there is on this, but it's actually a very complicated practical question. New Zealand is not an equal partner in the Five Eyes Alliance. It is the smallest, least influential member. And the practical effect of that is that we have a little bit of latitude, but very little latitude. People who work in the government understand from their officials that we can say no to this, but if we're going to say no to this thing, we have to say yes to all the other ones, pretty much. That's the kind of status that we have in that alliance. And so my personal belief is that you either have to be in or out, basically, that New Zealand is not in the position to say we want half the alliance or 2/3 of it or a quarter or something. What I would recommend, and my own view is that it is a completely unsuitable setting for New Zealand and we should be out. And what would I think that we should do about it? So my view is that we should be bold enough to realise that we're fooling ourselves about us naturally belonging there, and that our next 100 years are going to be there, our next 70 years. It's just not the right setting for us. And so how do we get out of it? I would suggest that we can't renegotiate it, we can't ask for half or something, it won't work. Nobody inside the intelligence agencies would believe that was possible. And so I think that the way to leave it will be to start to set our own terms. For example, Richard has raised one which I've said lots of times, which is that according to New Zealand of this century, there is completely no way that we should be spying on our specific neighbours, down to the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's Secretary, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, all those countries, the UN offices there in Fiji and so on. We shouldn't be doing that. So we should just say, we'll stay in the alliance, but we won't do this. We won't be joining in the wars in the Middle East, and we won't be spying on our neighbours here, but we will do these other things. And I think that would have the practical effect of renegotiating our membership quite quickly. In other words, we would end up not in it. But it's a scary and bold thing which is required because it's very non-linear, like it's sort of one thing or the other.
Kia ora, thanks very much for your presentations. Now I know this is intelligence agencies, but I've been noticing more and more it looks like the police are acting from the same playbook, especially when it comes to spying on and acting against environmental activists, and with things like using facial recognition software without having it authorised. And I'm just wondering if you have any comments on what levels of oversight of any of these agencies we should be looking to, given that at the moment all we have is the so-called Independent Police Conduct Authority, which isn't independent.
That's a very good point. And when I say a lot of the things that the SIS does are better done by the police, then that's a pretty effective warning that what the extent to which the police or agencies should be investigating and intercepting communications for people involved in legitimate democratic protest activity where the boundary is. As I said, there are things when it has consequences in terms of property damage and the like, but it shouldn't be concerned about the possibility that there'll be a radical change in policy, which is what democracy should be all about. And I think there've been exposés about the use of what was it, Clark and somebody, intelligence agency, which involved things like sexual liaisons, honey traps, that sort of thing to get information. So you're quite right, it's very worrying that any agency should be taking those sort of lines.
I definitely endorse your attitude to getting out of the Five Eyes arrangements, because whilst we support militarism, as like New Zealand supports militarism because we're supporting the militaristic empire, we're obviously not going to be able to do much in respect to any other large policy positions, because militarism cuts across all that and supports the oil industry and supports the surveillance capitalist industry and keeps the banksters going and all the rest of it. So that's a major problem. But I'm very interested in like the truth of anything, and there's a couple of inquiries being run under the guise of Royal Commission. So there's the hit and run inquiry and also the Royal Commission into the Christchurch terror attack. How confident or how unconfident are you in respect to both of those that we might gain some truthful insight into what really happened in both of those situations?
Probably you first, Nicky.
Well, strangely, perhaps, I'm feeling reasonably optimistic about both of them. Both of those inquiries, the Operation Burnham one and the Christchurch one, were persuaded by the security services and the intelligence agencies that they had to do everything in secret. And not by the intelligence agencies and the SIS, of course, in the case of the Operation Burnham, that they had to do things in secret, that a lot of the documents couldn't be revealed, that the witnesses would have to be heard in secret, which wasn't ideal. But I think that if when we get those reports and we read them carefully, I would recommend them to people. I think that you'll be very surprised and interested by how much information is going to come. That's my hope and impression from having appeared in front of both of them.
I have a question for everyone here. How many of you have applied to get an SIS file? And has it been easy to obtain? I had 2 goes to get hold of mine, and I did find that I don't think there was hardly anything of, what was the phrase, national significance in it. Bolster started a branch of the Labour Party. Oh dear, 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 and other dangerous stuff like that.
This is kind of a philosophical question. So people within a society have a kind of philosophy of surveillance, about the balance between privacy and how much a community should be able to know about people's activity. And I'm just wondering, with technology, do you think that the risks of an individual or a group of people to wreak havoc on quite a big scale is increasing, if you know what I mean? I'm thinking maybe about bio warfare, or the access of people to technology, that a small group of people could do a lot more damage than they could in the past.
Well, I think that, as Mike said, the risk of somebody building and utilising a nuclear weapon is getting easier all the time, and that remains a serious risk. And other types of weapons also getting easier to produce. And the other thing is, with the ability to communicate to a whole lot of people, conspiracy theories can spread widely and very effectively. So that's part of the threat. On the other hand, people are accepting CCTV cameras everywhere, which was a huge matter of debate when I was growing up. That was a fundamental breach of privacy. How could you start a new relationship if you're being seen, everything that you're doing? And people seem to accept that a lot more. But as I hinted at, if a lone person wants to do one of these things, the same reliance on technology and expecting them to communicate it through that technology is not valid. As we talked about Breivik in Norway, he just did it by himself, and so did the Christchurch gunman.
I'm not completely certain where you're going with. What I would say is that I don't think the threat of individuals has so increased that eliminates the reasonable rights to privacy and normal human rights, civil freedoms. But I'd go further than that and say, we're not living in an age where there's too many civil rights and the balance is on the wrong side that way. We're living in an age where things, I'm talking about looking overseas, where rights are on decline, and countries which are committed to civil rights and human rights are in decline. We're in an age where it's the opposite problem to the one you're talking about. We're also in an age where privacy is much more difficult, because the thing that technology has done is that it has astronomically increased the opportunity for surveillance and monitoring of people's lives. And so if I understood your question correctly, I would say that we're in an era where we need to be strengthening privacy and strengthening the rights of individuals and defending outposts of democratic, human rights-based society through these bad times, not thinking that there's new threats and we have to give it away.
Privacy is one of the greatest strengths, and like passwords against cybersecurity attacks, which are usually financial in nature, and they're the ones that are going to do the most harm. So if you actually drop privacy sort of protections, then you've got the risk of real massive economic damage.
People could be afraid that withdrawing from Five Eyes would make New Zealand insecure. But then we have to look at the other side of the coin, that perhaps Five Eyes actually threatens New Zealand because its policies are so militaristic and dangerous.
Well, I don't think it's specifically about the Five Eyes. I think it's a question about the extent to which you want to ally yourself with the foreign and other policies of a particular country. And at this stage, New Zealand's interests and values are very much not aligned with the values and interests of the current US government. So we would want to be much less involved with them unless and until that changes. So I don't think it's the existence of the Five Eyes intelligence network. It's the nature of the values and policies of the governments that are members of it. And as Nicky said, back in 1950, it was important to work with those countries to restore Europe and various other things, but that's no longer the case. The United States has drifted away from those sort of values that led to the Marshall Plan and things like that.
Why have successive New Zealand Prime Ministers tolerated the excesses of the SIS?
One part of it is the balance, and it occurs with the police activities, that these agencies should not be the agencies of partisan political action. And so traditionally, the heads of the SIS have used that to operate with a great deal of autonomy in terms of what their priorities are. Some of it is quite useful. I mentioned the fact that they vet the attributes of applicants for senior public service positions to to check their robustness in a sense, which is probably, it's useful that that sort of activity happens. But other sorts of things like developing a culture in which whatever happens to be the foreign policy of the United States and the United Kingdom, seeing they're much more bigger and more powerful, is bound to be right. And their attitude towards the majority of the South African population and towards Maori and New Zealand has been pretty appalling at times within that culture, because it's allowed to develop because of that degree of autonomy. And that's a careful balance. We don't want them to be like Muldoon's era, where he used them to get himself re-elected. So the way in which I sought to pursue it was to get them accountable to Parliament as a whole, that they'd be accountable not just to the Labour government, a Labour government or a national government, but to the Greens and New Zealand First, and to a greater extent to the New Zealand public and media.
I'll come at this from a slightly different direction. My impression in my lifetime is that we've had relatively few senior politicians and prime ministers who are interested in, have a background in and understand intelligence and issues like that. That Helen Clark was a rare exception. Obviously there was Norman Kirk, although I don't know, I'm too young to know about that. But it means that someone might become Prime Minister because they were great on social policy or economic policy or something else, and they get there and they get tutored by the senior officials who let them know really clearly that don't stuff this up. We are so lucky to be part of this Western Alliance, and don't do anything that will muck it up, and we've got obligations to be there, and we're so lucky to be there. Don't put a foot out of place on it. And they get taught that very sternly, that there's huge and grave implications if they were to harm the system. And unless they've got a broad, long experience of foreign policy type issues, as I say, like Helen Clark did, they can't stand up to it, is my belief. They're a captured audience. No one hears the briefings. No one ever sees the briefings. I think there can be a pushover, unfortunately.
Kia ora, Nicky and Richard. You talked about the creation of the idea that the biggest threat to New Zealand was terrorism some time ago. That creation of that idea relies strongly on the media picking it up and building that idea through various ways. I don't think the SIS has a direct voice to the people. I don't think many people would know who the members were. I don't think we hear them talk often. How do you see the role of the media in backing up these myths, if you like?
I would say that they're one of the contributing factors to an unrealistic view. And the reason for that is that if you put terrorist in a headline, people will buy the paper at the dairy. So we've all seen it. There's a great lure to news editors to take a story and beat it up about terrorism threats, not to have a nuanced and realistic approach to these things. And if it's fueled by the agencies talking about jihadi brides or something, they enthusiastically jump aboard. It's just, I'm afraid, it's sort of a structural problem of the news media which can feed into the problem you're talking about.
I think there's this tendency to group terrorists together. What the reality is that where oppression and inequality and injustice are occurring, then the people who are suffering from that, a number of them within that will become particularly extreme to match, in a sense, the extremity of the oppression that they feel that they're suffering under. And So each of them arises from what they see as injustice in their own situation. Sometimes it's real, sometimes it's a perception created by strong cultural elements in that country or by their own personality. But what we've seen is that attempts to create more equality and diversity and tolerance have meant that those at the bottom of the people who are in power feel that what's happening to them, that other people are becoming their equals, to them, as Greta Thunberg says, it feels like oppression. That's how they feel it, and that's how the white supremacists feel it.
Thank you for your very interesting talks. We've got a new government, relatively new government. What's your feeling about whether they might make some progress? A new CEO for the SIS? For the next 5 or 10 years. What are you hopeful about that?
I would be prepared to think that there's a genuine effort and intention to be slightly different, to be slightly more open, but not very open. I think that there are, based on what I've already been saying, there is no intention on the part of the officials, and we cannot rely on the officials to in any way substantially change their relationship within that alliance. That what we're not told, what they don't say in their annual reports, is that most of their training and most of their equipment and most of their planning and most of their operations are closely derived from or integrated into their allies. And they've got a limited leeway to change that. And so while they say we're going to modernise, or they say we're going to be more open, think in terms of 3 degrees. But no more than that, I would say.
The point of we started this series tonight talking about the SIS, was it looking the wrong way? And the question's been asked about could the SIS be modified? The thing that I would like to see, I think, is that the intelligence services were able to give us a clear definition of what was it about our security that they were intending to protect. Because if we had a clear understanding of that and they were open about it, a lot of these other things, it seems to me, could be improved. The second thing is, and we've talked a bit about it tonight about the Five Eyes alliance. The world is changing in front of us geopolitically very rapidly. It seems to me that one of the big problems with the Five Eyes alliance is that it positions us with a certain group of countries, the Anglophones, if you like, and that in the world as it's developing, as Richard I think said, is not a place that we will necessarily want to be. And in fact, right now, as it seems. And one of the disturbing things I think that's happened recently is the way the old idea used to be the GCSB did foreign intelligence and the SIS did civil intelligence. Well, since the Kim.com episode, where the Hollywood Reporter, believe it or not, revealed to ex-Senator Dodd, who was running the PR for the motion picture agencies, that the police and the agencies were going to raid Kim.com on his birthday the next year because they knew all the people they wanted to get were going to be there. That was subsequently discovered to be breaking the law, and what's happened, as far as I understand it, since Dame Patsy Reddy and Sir Michael Cullen reviewed that episode, the law has been changed so that now those agencies are entitled to work together. So we are also now, in my understanding, being surveyed by the GCSB as well as the SIS. And they're moving into, and this raise is not for tonight, it's another session. You asked about the media. I mean, we are in the middle of information war. It's massive, to be honest. Last year in London, or in England, I met a member of the 77 Brigade, which is the publicity unit set up in the British Army actively to promote their view about Russia. So there's a lot happening in our world at the moment. It's changing very rapidly. The issues that we're facing, I think, are ones that need to be in our consciousness. We need to be aware of what's going on, of what is happening, and I'll finish on that note to say thank you very much to Nicky and to Richard for helping us get some understanding about what has been happening, what is the thinking, and what we might in our own minds do about it. And I'll finish with one thing. Nicky mentioned Helen Clark. I saw the other day that she was saying, in relation to the Five Eyes, we were being drawn too close to the United States, and that would certainly be my view as well. So on that note, thank you very much for coming, and thank you again to Richard.